All right. Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants event. My name is Joe Grabowski, and I'll be your host for today. As I look at YouTube and I watch all the people talking in the chat, it's really exciting to see so many people joining in live today and continuing the learning from home. So it's so awesome to be able to broadcast these events live into living rooms and bedrooms and kitchens of parents and educators and students all across North America. So we have a really fun event planned for today. We're going to meet Canadian Astronaut Dave Williams in just a moment. But before we do, I want to talk about a few things we're doing during this call. So of course, you can join in via the chat. If you're on YouTube, send in some questions. Let us know where you're watching from. We'll keep an eye out for some of those. And then we're going to do Slido today. So I'm going to post a link into the chat, so to the Slido website. And then all you have to do is use the event code SPACE to join us. So there's a little poll question up right now. You can tell us if you would take a space flight if the opportunity was given to you. And then we're going to do a live quiz a little bit later as well. So you can compete and see if you can come out on top and if you were paying attention to Dave's talk today. All right, let's get to the main event. So Dave Williams was an emergency physician before the Canadian Space Agency selected him as one of 4 successful candidates from a field of over 5,000 applicants to begin astronaut training in 1992. He's flown on the Space Shuttle. He's visited the International Space Station. He took part in 3 spacewalks, which is the highest number of spacewalks. It's a Canadian record, so 17 hours and 47 minutes in space. We're going to talk about something a little bit different today. In October 2001, he became an Aquanaut through his participation in the joint NASA-NOAA NEEMO 1 mission, a training exercise held at Aquarius, the world's only underwater research laboratory. During the 7-day exercise, Dave became the first Canadian to have lived and worked in space and in the ocean. So Dave, it's always great to steal a little bit of your time. We have such an awesome group joining us from across North America, and we're excited to dive in with you.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here and welcome everyone. You know, right now we're all distancing from one another and things, and that's pretty similar to what it's like living on board the International Space Station or living on the Aquarius undersea research habitat, where of course underwater or in space, it's hard to get back to the surface of the planet. Anyway, I'm thrilled to be here, and it's going to be a lot of fun today to talk about living in that other final frontier, the undersea world. Interestingly, I was a little kid when I first dreamt of becoming an astronaut, and Joe talked about all the number of people that apply to be astronauts. One of the things I think is really neat about that statistic, though, is in Canada, when I applied, there were 5,300 applications, but 600 came from kids less than 10 years of age. And there's nothing wrong with having that dream of exploration, whether it's exploring space or exploring underwater and things. It's a really exciting thing to be able to do. So when I was 7 years old, I dreamt of becoming an astronaut, but in those days, Canada did not have an astronaut program. So it seemed like that was impossible. So I shifted my focus. I said, well, if I can't go to space and explore that frontier, maybe I'll live and work underwater and explore that final frontier. So I actually started scuba diving when I was 12 years of age. And ironically, I flew in space as an astronaut before I became an aquanaut and lived underwater. But often, you know, as an astronaut, everybody asks me, what is it like living in space? What's it like working? So when Joe and I were talking, we said, why don't we talk about living underwater and talk about the habitat and the different environments that we have to work in and train in and things. So I put together a bit of a presentation. Is it okay, Joe, if I start my presentation?
Yeah, let's do it.
Excellent. So I'm going to bring up my screen and we will go over here. And there we are, through the magic of modern technology, the 4 of us. Now, you'll notice that this is 2006. This isn't the first underwater mission that I did. This is the second one. And I did this with Nicole Stott, Ron Guerin, both NASA astronauts, and Tim Broderick, who is a general surgeon and things. So we were underwater over Easter in 2006 for 18 days. It was an amazing experience living and working in that environment. But of course, as I mentioned, I had the dream when I was a little kid. And this is what it was like when I was, I just turned 13, actually. I was diving in Lake Champlain. And the equipment that we wore in those days is totally different than the equipment that we wear today. There's been a lot of evolution in the technology, but fundamentally exploring underwater is basically the same as it was back then. When we live underwater, we use scuba equipment like you saw in the picture that I just showed you, but we also use these modified helmets. This is a Kirby Morgan super light helmet that supplies us air to breathe. We breathe air, we don't breathe 100% oxygen like we do in space when we're doing a spacewalk. So that's a little bit different, but we wanted to evaluate these helmets as well. The habitat sits at a depth of around 60, 65 feet or so, and it's off the coast of Key Largo, Florida. So this is a great diagram of where the habitat sits on Conch Reef. And of course, underwater, you don't want to get lost. So we don't have roads or anything underwater, but we have what are called transect lines. These are pieces of rope that are attached to the bottom of the ocean, and they have little signs on them like habitat, go this way, just to make sure you don't get lost, because you cannot go to the surface when you're living underwater. We train just like we do in space. We train for a couple of weeks before the mission. You know, for the underwater mission, most things are measured in weeks, whereas when we train to go to space, it's measured in years. But we take the same approach in training for an underwater mission as we would for a space flight, and we use the same timelines. We work together as a crew, and we have a mission support team. So the crew are wearing the dark shirts, and the mission support team, they're all wearing the white shirts. But just like in mission control, supporting the International Space Station, we have a whole team of individuals supporting these underwater missions. So of course, we work really hard, go through the training, we get ready for splashdown. Instead of lift off, we call this splashdown. We get into our wetsuits and we put on our scuba diving equipment and you get into the water. This, my second underwater mission on NEEMO 9 was quite different than my first one. NEEMO 1, it was a 6.5 foot swell the day that we did the splashdown. So the boat was rocking around and things, but for NEEMO 9, it was really calm. It was just spectacularly beautiful. And you swim down to the habitat. And the amazing thing about the habitat is there's no door like we would have, you know, at home on Earth. There's what we call a wet porch, and you're looking up into the habitat on the right-hand side of the slide, not that little white thing, that's called a gazebo, but the habitat is on the right-hand side of the slide, and you can just see the reflection of water from that air fluid interface. So imagine if you took a bucket and you put a bucket upside down into a swimming pool and you pushed it down, air is going to get trapped in the bucket, and the water will enter the bucket a little bit until the pressure of the air is the same as the water, and then it's not going to go any farther in. And the habitat is the same thing. The habitat's essentially a big upside down bucket, and the water pressure equals the pressure inside the habitat, so the water doesn't come into the habitat at all. And we swim into this wet porch. Again, you can see a great reflection there of the water level on the wet porch, and the four of us are swimming in. You can see the tanks that we use, and we stick our head up in the wet porch, and all of a sudden we're in the habitat. So it's pretty cool. We have to take off all of our diving equipment and things, and then we climb up the stairs into this wet portion of the habitat. And the habitat's divided, just like the space station has different modules, the habitat's divided into different areas. There's a wet porch, then there's an area where we towel off and go into a research area. Then there's the living quarters where we have the kitchen and the bunks and things. And we'll give you a bit of a tour of the habitat in a sec. But how do we get food down? You know, if we want to send food to the International Space Station, we have to have a rocket to send it there. Taking food and supplies down to the underwater habitat, we put them inside these pressure-tight vessels, we bring them down to the habitat, and then we equalize the pressure through the knob on the top of that vessel, and then we open it up and we can take out whatever it is, whether it's fresh bread or fresh fruit or a new camera or batteries, whatever we need for the mission. So the dives, you know, I always wonder why it is when I do a spacewalk, it takes me so long to get into my spacesuit to go outside. And yet when I want to do a dive from the undersea research habitat, it's roughly 15, 20 minutes to get suited up to go outside. And that's one of the challenges that we have to solve for the lunar missions in the future and living on Mars. the ability to put on a spacesuit quickly and go outside and do a spacewalk will be something that's really important for us. And we can talk about that afterwards in the questions. But we would explore the bottom of the ocean. We had a whole series of experiments looking at the center of gravity for the Apollo spacesuits. We tried to emulate as much as possible the type of experiments we would do in space. And basically, we rehearse all of our space flights on the Aquarius undersea research habitat. So navigating underwater, it's a fairly complex phenomenon. So we looked at different tools and techniques that we would use to be able to navigate. And we also evaluated using rovers. So just like in space where we have robots, and on Mars, we have rovers exploring the surface of Mars. So the future of space exploration is probably astronauts working in parallel with rovers. So just like we would do that in space, we have rovers underwater. And Nicole is piloting one of those rovers, exploring the bottom of the ocean around the habitat. But towards the end of the session, she flew the rover over by the viewing port in the habitat. This is where we have lunch and things. We were actually having lunch, and all of a sudden the rover's there, so we were waving at the rover. It was a lot of fun to be able to do that. You can see the rovers parked on the wet porch, and the line that we use to provide power and communication to the rover basically is coiled up, and we get it ready to go. But if you want to operate the rover, you just simply fly it off the wet porch, and away you go, and you can explore. It's interesting that we use the term fly. It's very similar to what we would in an aerospace environment, but the underwater world is kind of like that. We also evaluated remote surgery. So we had a surgeon in Hamilton, Ontario, in Canada, 2,000 miles away from the Aquarius undersea research habitat, and we brought a surgical robot and a surgical simulator. So this is not a real person, it's not a real patient, but we're practicing to see if you can do surgery at a distance using these robotic capabilities. And that's important if we're thinking about going back to the moon and ultimately on Mars. But we also decided, let's test this robot and see if we can do other things with it. So we had 2 lunar scientists sorting simulated specimens from the moon to see if we could do lunar geology, do tele-geology with astronauts on the moon, sorting through lunar specimens with a video link up with planetary geologists on Earth. And of course, the big difference living underwater and being in space is underwater, you actually have neighbors. And this is a barracuda. And you'll notice they have fairly big teeth there. It's got his mouth open a little bit. On my first underwater mission, NEEMO 1, that lasted a week, that was in 2001, as Joe mentioned, we were doing an educational outreach event with students throughout North America. I was outside on the reef, and I was wearing one of those helmet masks so I could communicate with the students. And one of the students says, "What's that thing over your shoulder?" And I turn around, there was this big barracuda there. And I said, "Oh, that's a barracuda." And then he says, "Well, are you about to be eaten?" And I said, "No, you don't have to worry about barracuda. They're not going to bite you or anything like that." But these barracuda would hang around the habitat, and you get really used to going outside and seeing them. We have all the reef fish and things around the habitat. And these eagle rays were quite amazing. I remember one time I was down on the bottom of the reef at a depth of around 70 feet or so. And all of a sudden, it was the middle of the day, but it suddenly got dark. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. And I looked up, and there was a formation of 8 eagle rays that kind of flew over top of us. And it basically blocked out the sun. It was absolutely amazing being able to see them. And then they swam off into the blue mist. So yes, we were underwater for Easter, and just like on board the International Space Station, we have crew members in space for holidays, for their birthdays and things. We did bring the NEEMO 9 bunny down with us, and actually we took the bunny on a dive and things, but that was kind of fun. And great picture of Nicole and Ron, both of who went on to do long duration missions on the International Space Station. Now, how do you get back to the surface? Because we said you can't really go to the surface when you're living on an undersea habitat. And the question is, why not? So I'm sure all of you have enjoyed a soft drink at some point in your lives. And you know that if you get particularly a large plastic container of soft drink and you open the top, you unscrew the top, you hear a hiss. And that's because the pressure inside the container is greater than it is outside. And the pressure keeps the gas dissolved in solution. So when you open the thing up, you hear the hiss, the pressure is released, and all of a sudden you get bubbles, and that's really kind of cool. That's what's going to happen to your body if you go to the surface too quickly when you're underwater. And it's called the bends. And what ends up happening is the nitrogen that's in the air that we breathe gets dissolved into our blood and into our tissues, and that's all fine. But if you go back to the surface too quickly and the pressure decreases too quickly, just like taking the top off a soda can, then all of a sudden you're going to get bubbles in your blood and bubbles in your tissue, and that's not good. So at the end of the mission, what we do is we put on these masks and we breathe 100% oxygen in about 20-minute intervals spaced out over the course of 17 hours. We basically lie in our bunks for 17 hours. We're watching DVDs. It's amazing how many movies you can watch while you're decompressing to come back to the surface. And what ends up happening is over the course of time, we close the watertight door and we slowly over that 17-hour time period, raise or lower the pressure actually in the habitat so that it's the equivalent to being on the surface of the ocean. And that takes us 17 hours to do that. So we're resting, we're breathing, and because we're going through this protocol, the bubbles don't come out of the tissue in our solution. Everything is fine. It works out really, really well. But then at the end of 17 hours, we're stuck in the habitat with the door closed. What do? So what we do is we very rapidly increase the pressure again. And because the pressure is increasing, the temperature goes up. So you feel it getting warm. It gets a little foggy and things. And then once the pressure is the same as the water pressure outside, we open that hatch. And then basically we grab what's called a small little pony bottle and we swim up to the surface. So there's one of us. I can't even remember which crew member that was. Might have been me. But I'm holding on to the pony bottle and I'm going up this rope from the habitat to the surface after that 17-hour decompression. So just like being in space where you can't just come back to the surface of the Earth, when you're living underwater, you just can't come back to the surface of the Earth. It takes time for us to be able to come back. But at the end of the mission, just like a space flight, it's really exciting finishing the mission successfully. You know, when you're living underwater for 18 days, that was longer than my first space flight. In fact, it's an unbelievable experience. And you miss things like the wind and the rain. You know, there's nothing quite like taking that first breath of fresh sea air and thinking, wow, here I am back on the surface of our planet. And that probably resonates with a lot of you right now because we've all been stuck inside for the last few weeks and we're all looking forward to being able to get outside. So it is quite similar in many ways to being in space when you're living underwater, but there are differences. And I think that's one of the exciting things that we're going to have a chance to chat about today. So maybe we'll open it up for some questions. Joe, I'll turn it back to you.
All right. Sounds good, Dave. Thanks for that awesome presentation. I mean, just watching it, you can see how the Aquarius Reef Base is a great spot to train for space missions, how in many ways it is very similar to some of the conditions and things you experience in space. So that's pretty cool. All right, so the classrooms who are joining us live today, we have groups joining us live on YouTube. We're going to start a quiz in just a moment to see how well you're paying attention to Dave's talk. I've shared the link one more time in the chat sidebar, so go to Slido and use the event code SPACE, and you can join us there. I'm going to give a few shout outs that have come in via YouTube so far. So Dave, we've got groups joining us obviously throughout Ontario. We've got groups in Georgia, in California, let's see, Maine, Little Rock, Arkansas. Where else? A few more here. Alberta, British Columbia. So we've got lots of great groups joining us. So keep introducing yourselves. I'll keep an eye out for those as well. You can start sending in some of your questions. In the Slido room, I've just opened up the quiz, so you can join the quiz part now. Now, Dave, there was a poll question in there that people were answering of whether they would go to space if given the opportunity. 75% said 100% yes, they would. 25% said no way. They would absolutely not go to space. So that's pretty cool. 75% is pretty good.
That's very good. You know, space is not necessarily for everyone, and that's totally fine. But being able to go to space is an incredible experience. Living underwater is an incredible experience, and exploring the surface of our planet is really amazing. Yesterday for Earth Day, I put a video up on my Facebook site about going to the Antarctic and exploring the Antarctic Peninsula. So there are many, many really neat things to do under the ocean, on the surface of the Earth, and in space.
All right, so perhaps at the end, I'll open a poll question, see how many would live for a week in Aquarius. We'll see if more people will go underwater instead of all the way to space. We'll see what happens. Okay, so I see we've got lots, over 40 groups already have joined the quiz. So I'm gonna get it started now. It's 4 questions, some are multiple choice, some are true and false. There's 20 seconds on the clock for each question. The faster you answer the question, the higher your score. So we'll see who our top 3 champions are. So here we go. First question coming up. How deep is the deepest part of Aquarius reef base? Is it 200 feet? Is it 60 feet? Is it 100 feet? Or is it 20 feet? So it's in the Florida Keys. It's down at the bottom. How deep is that only underwater reef laboratory in the world? Got 5 more seconds. All right, fairly split on this one, but 41% went with 60 feet. So good job to almost half of the group tuning in. All right, let's jump to the next question. This one here, Dave, was Dave an aquanaut before he was an astronaut? So true or false? Dave was an aquanaut before he was an astronaut. Let's see what happens here. Dave was an aquanaut before an astronaut. Got 5 more seconds. Very interesting. All right, we split 51-49. 51% said true, he was an aquanaut first, but in fact, Dave went to space first. So the 49% who went false were correct. Let's jump to the next question. Okay, how old was Dave when he started scuba diving? Was he between 10 to 20? Was he between 20 to 30? Or was he between 30 to 40 years old? 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40. And I've got some good news for students who are tuning in is once you hit 10, there are some courses that you can start taking if you do want to start making your way to becoming a certified diver. And I highly suggest, and I know Dave would too, that as soon as you can, you start getting underwater and exploring another amazing part of our planet. So 63% were correct, 10 to 20. Dave, I think you said you were 12 years old?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, final question. Let's take it home. Before space flight, there is a quarantine. There is also a quarantine before underwater training missions. Is that true or is that false? So before space flight, there's a quarantine. There's also a quarantine before underwater training missions. Is that true or false? Got 5 more seconds. All right, Dave, 76% said that's true. What can you tell us about that?
Well, it is true. And, you know, if you think about it, you don't want to get sick in space, which is why we have the quarantine before space flight. But you don't want to get sick if you're living underwater. Can you imagine having a cold and then with all this increased pressure around you going out and trying to scuba dive with a cold? That's pretty well impossible to do. And in fact, as a doctor, if somebody said to me, can I go scuba diving with a cold? I would say, no, you really should wait until the cold resolves because you're not able to equalize the pressure in your ear. And you know, it's really amazing. We can do weather forecasting underwater in the habitat without even looking at the surface of the ocean because you can tell if it's windy because the waves are higher. And when the waves are higher, if you have a 6-foot wave that goes over the habitat, all of a sudden it's like the pressure increases. So it's like the habitat's 6 feet deeper. You feel it in your ear. So you can feel the wave action on the surface of the ocean in your ear. And, you know, if your ear is kind of clearing back and forth quite frequently, it's a windy day up there and you've got a lot of swell. And if it's a nice calm day, you don't even notice it at all. It's pretty incredible.
All right, very cool. So our results, Ethan, first place, 4 out of 4 points in 25 seconds. Tara Duggan, 4 out of 4 points in 27 seconds. And Isabella, 4 out of 4 in 28 seconds. So congratulations to our top 3 finishers. Good job, and thanks for playing along with us today. Okay, so Dave, let's rock and roll some questions. I do want to introduce some of our camera groups. So we have Amy and Isabella joining us in Fishers, Indiana. We'll meet them shortly. We've got Miss McLaughlin joining us from St. Catharines. Her grade 6s are watching online. Mrs. Gallant from Guelph, Ontario. Her grade 6s are watching online. And then Mrs. Caminiti has some of her grade sixes in Ottawa, and some of them are joining us on camera today. So just a reminder to those grade sixes on camera, if you click participants and then raise your hand, I'll see the little blue hand and I'll know to pick you. But let's go to Amy and Isabella in Indiana and see what question they have for us to start.
So you said you did that more for training, like that was used for training to go to outer space. Could you use that to explore marine biology, like the marine life down on the seafloor? Are there more underwater habitats that are more based for the marine biology?
Well, you know, Aquarius is the world's only undersea research habitat. And the real reason why they created Aquarius was to do marine biology experiments, just like you're mentioning. In fact, the first mission, NEEMO 1, that we did, most of the science experiments that we participated in were marine biology, marine science experiments, looking at what proportion of the coral was still alive, what proportion of the coral was dead, trying to determine the impacts of changing temperature in the ocean and how that affects coral life and things. So the answer is yes. And if you love the undersea world, and if you love marine biology, then this is a really amazing place to be, because you get to live in this unique environment for, you know, in our case, it was almost 3 weeks. It was a little under 3 weeks. And it's really incredible when you go out and you're swimming around with the fish. They're like your neighbors. And after a while, the fish get to know you. It's pretty interesting. You know, when I go scuba diving, normally I'm underwater for 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes or an hour or so, but it's a pretty short time that I'm underwater. Imagine driving through a city for an hour and you look around, you go, wow, it looks really pretty incredible, but you're not there for any long period of time. When you live underwater, you're living there for, you know, a couple of weeks. It's like visiting a city and going out and seeing what's going on and visiting different areas. So it's a pretty amazing experience. And you're totally correct. Really, the best part about doing the marine science underwater is that you're in the environment. You can study all the changes that are taking place on the reef.
All right. Well, Isabella joined us in an event earlier in the week, and we learned that she is a future marine biologist. So I'm not surprised that she had that question for us today. All right. Mrs. Gallant in Guelph, do you have a question or two from your students?
I do. I'm just looking on two screens here. The question is if you have a favorite marine animal.
Well, the answer is yes. And it's a bit of a tough call, you know, because there's so many marine animals and fish and things like that. I would go with the mammal, and I would go with the dolphin. And, you know, dolphins are incredibly smart, and they have their own language and they can communicate and things. They're part of the cetacean family. So, you know, other species like whales and things, they're pretty impressive. But I think for me anyway, swimming with the dolphin is an amazing thing because they're just so streamlined. They're so smart, and you feel like you're a visitor in this unique world, you know? So I would say they're my favorite.
All right, grabbing a question from YouTube. This is from Latoya, and she is wondering about the food that you can bring down to Aquarius. Is there anything that you can't bring down to the reef base?
Well, the food, it's interesting. The first time we did a NEEMO mission, we thought we need to make this very space-like. So we got space food, the same food that we would take in the space shuttle or up to the International Space Station. We sent it down, we stocked the habitat. The habitat technicians, they'd never eaten space food before, so everybody was really excited to have the space food. Then after about 3 days of this, you know, it gets a little repetitive and the food's a little bit boring. People are saying, well, enough of this. We want our regular food. So, you know, we wanted to have fresh apples and fresh fruit and things. So all the food that we get is essentially purchased in a supermarket by what we call the topside team. That team in mission control, we call those the topside folks because they're living on the surface of the earth and we're living underwater. And they go out and they do our shopping for us, and they put our food in those special pressurized containers. They bring them to the underwater habitat, and we're able to make whatever meals we can. Now, the interesting thing is, just like in space, you don't want food that creates smelly trash. So in terms of fruits, having an apple or grapes is fantastic because you can basically eat the whole thing. There's not really much trash left. If you bring a banana, most of us don't eat the banana peel. So you've got a banana peel which is in your wet trash, which begins to smell after a period of time. So we would, take all of our trash, package it up, put it in one of those containers, and after the food comes down, the trash goes back up and things. But the smell that's associated with some of the trash can be a bit of a problem, and that's true in space as well. But one of the things that was really fun is when you're diving, even though the water temperature was 70, 72, 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty warm, we're wearing wetsuits because we're out in the water so long. I would go out on a 4-hour dive. We could refill our tanks on the reef and things. So you're in the water a lot, which means you're cold when you come back inside. So we had a contest on how to make the best hot chocolate underwater. So it starts off, you get your hot water, and we would add, I think it was Swiss Miss chocolate mix, and you stir that all up. And that's really, really good. And of course, you can put marshmallows on it. And then somebody had a really bright idea that if you take a chocolate bar and you put it in your hot chocolate, and you put that in the microwave for 20 seconds, it melts the chocolate bar, and you can kind of stir that around and dissolve that. And that makes it really, really rich and really sugary. But boy, it tastes pretty good if you've been in the water for a period of time. And then somebody came up with the idea, why don't we add a little chocolate pudding in there to get a little stronger consistency? So turns out, just like in space where astronauts enjoy playing with their food, when you're living underwater, you can play with your food as well.
All right, very cool. Some innovation from astronauts at the bottom of the ocean. All right, Mrs. Community, let me turn your microphone on. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Hi, Dr. Dave Williams. My question is, what is the biggest difference being underwater and being in space?
So I think the biggest single difference is the fact that underwater you have neighbors. There are other living things immediately available. As soon as you get into the water in the wet porch, there's generally barracuda or other fish that are there. And you have this sense that you're part of this living entity, this reef. Whereas in space, the only living things are the crew inside the space station or whatever spacecraft you're in. And you're looking at this beautiful blue oasis of the planet Earth. This home of everything that we know and all living entities has taken place on our own planet. And then you feel like you're distant from that. And that's one of the biggest differences, I think, between the two environments. Both are surprisingly beautiful, and both are quite dangerous. Space, we're living in an extreme vacuum where the temperature ranges are significant, but underwater, we have the pressure to deal with and the fact that we can't go to the surface if there's a problem. And we're relying on the technology of our scuba gear to be able to work perfectly so we don't get into trouble. So in both environments, you have to pay attention. And I find it's kind of interesting that many of the really beautiful places to visit, whether it's in space or underwater or climbing mountains, there's an element of danger and managing risk associated with it. And that's why we have to get trained to be able to do these missions.
All right, great question. So just a reminder, everybody who's tuning in today, if you're enjoying today's event, we host 3 to 4 live events a day at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants with scientists, explorers, adventurers, and conservationists from all over the world. So do check out some more of the events. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel on the bottom right. There's a little mountain with a pair of pants on it. That's our symbol. We're going to grab a question from YouTube now. So Annika is joining us on YouTube, and she's wondering about your time on the space station. When you had free time, what did you do? What did you do to pass the time?
So in space, the best thing to do when you have free time is look out the window. The Earth is unbelievably beautiful. And of course, we're orbiting the Earth every hour and a half. So we see a sunrise and a sunset every 45 minutes. And the planet's never the same. You can be flying over the same continent and you look down and the cloud patterns are different. If you go over Africa or South America at night, often you'll see thunderstorms with the lightning going from the clouds down to the ground. And we call it nature's fireworks show. It's really pretty incredible. Or even more amazing is when you get to see the northern lights or the southern lights and dancing over a quarter of the planet. It's just absolutely spectacular. But underwater is really beautiful as well. And I'd never really done a dawn dive before I lived underwater. I'm a scuba diving instructor. I've been teaching diving since 1976 with NOAA, but I've done night dives and that sort of thing before. But when you live on the undersea research habitat, you can do a dawn dive. So you get up at 6 in the morning before the sun comes up. You put on all your diving equipment, which is tough because your wetsuit is cold and it's wet and you're just waking up and things. But you get into the water and you swim out on the reef and you turn off your flashlight and it's totally black. And you see these biophosphorescent plankton that are kind of swimming around, glowing in the dark. It's spectacularly beautiful. And you just lie on the bottom of the reef, on the bottom of the ocean, looking up at the surface. And you can't see it, of course, because it's totally black. But then as the sun begins to come up, the water goes from being totally black to a deep, deep purple color. And you can just get a sense of where the surface is. And then it goes to a lighter purple, a dark blue, a light blue. And then finally, this brilliant, clear turquoise where you're looking up through the sun's rays at the surface of the ocean. And again, you can't go there. It's not far away. It's only 50 feet away, but you can't go there. And you look up almost wistfully, thinking, wow, what's it going to be like when I finish the mission and I can swim back up to the surface of the ocean again? So both of them are really, really beautiful, but they're both quite different experiences.
There we go. So I did open up a new poll question in the Slido. This is, would you spend a week living in the Aquarius Reef Base? And so far, it's 84% say yes. So more people would live underwater, Dave, than take that trip to space so far. We'll see if the results change over the next few minutes. Mrs. McLaughlin, let me turn your microphone on. Do you have a question or two from your group joining us?
They would like to know if you had to choose between a space mission or an underwater mission, which one would you choose and why?
There's no such thing as a bad mission, period. They're all great. Now, having said that, if I could choose between going to space tomorrow or going underwater tomorrow, I would go to space. And the reason why I say that is because it's a lot harder to get to space than it is to get underwater. I can go diving pretty easily. I've got diving equipment at home, and I used to dive in Maine. Actually, I started open water ocean diving in Maine. I've been diving in British Columbia. I've been diving in California, some really amazing diving, by the way. Been diving in Florida. So I've been diving all over the world. But because of all that, I would go to space. And if anybody said, hey, is there somebody interested in going to Mars? I'd be the first person to put my hand up. The but, though, is I want to go on the two-way trip to Mars. I want to make sure that I've got a return flight. I'm not just going to go there and stay there and things. But exploring space is absolutely incredible. And my definition of exploration is relentlessly seeking knowledge with passion. And it's an interesting definition, because I came to that after I'd been an aquanaut and an astronaut, and I realized that fundamentally I'm an exploration scientist. I like doing science in extreme harsh environments. So whether that's in space or underwater, whether it's in the Antarctic or the Arctic or at altitude on a mountain and things, I'm really passionate about trying to understand how humans perform and live and work and how their body adapts to those environments. So exploration science rocks. It's pretty cool.
All right, awesome. We're going to grab a couple questions, one from the Slido, one from the YouTube. But I do want to shout out to Mrs. Kamenides group. Don't be shy. Put your hand up in the chat and I will pick one or two of you to ask a question. If you don't know where to put your little blue hand up, you can also use the chat bar. There's a chat option at the bottom of the Zoom page, and you can send me a question there and I'll know to turn your microphone on for a question. But Dave, this question is from Anonymous in the Slido room, and they're wondering, is it harder to sleep in the Aquarius or the International Space Station? Did you find it harder to sleep in one of the spots?
It's an interesting question. In space, you're kind of floating around, and it takes you a while to get used to sleeping essentially upright, because it just depends on the orientation of your sleep restraint system or your sleeping bag. On the space station, each crew member has their own quarters, their own sleep quarters and things, and their sleeping bag is in there. The big problem in space is noise. And for that reason, some people actually sleep with earplugs and things. And the noise comes from the fans that circulate the air on the International Space Station. Those fans can be pretty noisy. Underwater, it's pretty relaxing. So I think I find it probably a little bit easier to sleep underwater because gravity's there. So you're sleeping, horizontal, just like you would. You've got a bunk just like you would at home. And you've got a nice pillow that you're sleeping on. the hull of the habitat, you know, the wall is right beside your shoulder. And it can be pretty cold and things, but fortunately you're in a nice warm sleeping bag. And the amazing part about falling asleep underwater is we have a viewing porch in the bunk area. So we can actually lie in our bunks and look through this viewing port, this window. And at nighttime, we turn the lights on outside the habitat and you see all these fish swimming around and things, and you fall asleep looking at these beautiful fish swimming around on the reef. And you begin to wonder who's really in the aquarium here, because you look out the window and it looks like an aquarium, but the fish are looking in at us. So maybe we're the ones that are really in the aquarium.
All right. So the young animator is wondering about changes you've noticed in the ocean. So you've, you know, been lucky to be diving for a long time. Have you noticed changes over the years? So maybe some spots you visited when you were younger to visiting them today.
The sad answer is yes. And the Aquarius Undersea Research Habitat is pretty well adjacent to the John Pennekamp Underwater Marine Sanctuary. And this is a marine sanctuary where there's supposed to be no fishing, and, you know, ideally there's no trash on the bottom of the ocean and things like that. And very sadly, you know, we'd be out on a dive and you'd see a plastic bag being carried by the current going across the sand on the bottom, or beer cans on the bottom of the ocean. So yes, you can see the effect that trash that's been dumped in the ocean is having. And certainly if you look at the water temperatures globally, and there's good scientific data, you can go to the NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration website, and look at the data that exists there about the change in water temperature globally. But we're seeing that different parts of the reef that used to be alive, and I used to dive in Florida when I was really, really young, and I would go and the reef was vibrant and alive and things, and now there's parts of that reef that used to be alive that are dead, the coral's dead and things, because of the changes that are taking place. I went diving on the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, an amazing place to dive, but again, you're beginning to see changes that are taking place. And what it does is it really reminds all of us of the importance of planetary stewardship, that sense of taking care of the planet for future generations. All astronauts get when we're in space and we get a chance to see the Earth from such a unique perspective. And certainly when you're underwater, it reinforces that same concept of the need to take care of our planet. You know, many of us like walking in the woods, and there's nothing more frustrating than walking in the woods on a beautiful fall day and the leaves are changing color. I mean, you go to Maine or you go to Vermont in the fall and the leaves are spectacular. And you're walking down the trail and there's a beer can there, or there's a candy bar wrapper or something. So I'm one of these people that believes on leaving no trace, whether you're underwater, whether you're in space, or whether you're, you know, in the woods, basically taking your trash out with you and leaving the planet the way it was.
All right. That's a great point that you brought up, Dave. I think if there was a way somehow we could get everybody to experience looking down on our planet the way that you and many of your colleagues have, I think that could go a long way to, you know, helping people realize that we have this spaceship Earth, and that we do have to protect it. Maybe as virtual reality gets better in the future, we'll be able to mimic that experience a little better.
Yes.
All right. Let's see. Let's visit a couple more groups who are with us on camera. So let's go back to Amy and Isabella. Your mic is on.
You said that you can't just go up because of the pressure and your blood will turn to bubbles. Is there a maximum depth that you can go without having to worry about not being able to return upwards without your blood? Yeah.
Without the bends.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So if I remember correctly, we can't go deeper than 110 feet, and we can't go up past 40 feet. And basically between 40 feet and around 110 feet, it's a no decompression zone. So you can swim around and not worry about, you know, gas coming out of the tissue and bubbles in your blood or bubbles in your tissue. And we take this really, really seriously. So we have depth gauges. You know, you saw that on the picture of me when I was 12 years old. You could see all the stuff coming around the side of my body. So the depth gauges, it's on a console. And sometimes when you're swimming along, instead of having your console tucked into your weight belt, your console is just kind of hanging down. And the cable that it's on, the pressurized hose, actually, to be fair, the hose that it's on is about 3.5, 4 feet long. So you could be at 107 feet depth and kind of roll, and your depth gauge goes to 111 feet, even though your body didn't go below 110. We take that stuff really, really seriously. You never, ever want to be in a position where you're breaking one of the no decompression limits. And I think that's one of the things that's so important, you know, when you're exploring in those worlds, understanding what your limits are. Jacques Cousteau, back in the 1960s, he had an undersea habitat, and there was one that was at a shallow depth and one that was much deeper. And he used a submersible, a submarine, to go between the two habitats to avoid the problem with decompression sickness. And I think, to your point, you know, it's interesting that so many people want to live underwater, and yet we only have one undersea research habitat in the world. I think it's an opportunity for all of us. It's a lot cheaper to explore the undersea world than it is to go to space. 70% of our planet's covered by water. So maybe there's a great opportunity for you in the future. I mean, you're going to be a marine biologist. That is so cool, by the way. I'm a little bit envious, I have to tell you. And if you get a chance to go to Woods Hole, it's an amazing research facility. I did some research at Friday Harbor Laboratories up in the San Juan Islands with the University of Washington. That's incredible. But check out Woods Hole. It's an amazing place as well.
All right, very cool. And we do events with Woods Hole from time to time when they've got Elvin out on the boat. So we get to see the submersible Elvin, which is pretty cool. So keep an eye out for the next time we can do one of those. Mrs. Caminiti, Mrs. McLaughlin, Mrs. Gallant, give me a hand raise if we have another question from your students, if I have to come back and visit. All right, let's get started. Ms. McLaughlin, then we'll go to Mrs. Gallant. So let me unmute. There it is. Okay, we're ready.
Awesome. This is a question from Matthew M. and Henry, who's a grade 2 student, but the grade 6 is the first one. And they wanted to know, what was it like to live and walk in space?
Amazing. I don't know that there's a word in the English language, to be quite honest with you, to capture how incredible it is being able to live in space. First of all, you realize that you're completely reliant on the technology working, all the habitation systems on the space station and things. And then when you go outside, it's really quite different. You know, I compare this to being in a school bus driving through a community. It's kind of like what it's like being in the space station, and then being on your bike, wearing your helmet and all that stuff, all the protective equipment, but being on your bike and riding around a neighborhood on your bike is kind of what it's like spacewalking. You're just immersed in the environment. And, you know, it's unbelievable. On my second spacewalk, I was riding on the end of the Canadarm, and about halfway through the spacewalk, our pilot, Charlie Hobaugh, had to reposition the arm and reprogram it. So the arm was extended 60 feet straight out. I was on the end of the arm, but it was pointing straight aft of the space station. So I couldn't see the space station anymore. I couldn't, you know, it's hard to look at your feet. You can do it. You can bend over and look down at your feet, but it's just easier to look straight ahead. And I started looking straight ahead, and the only thing I could see was the planet beneath me. I couldn't see the space station anymore. I couldn't see the robotic arm. And after about a minute or so of this, I thought, it's like I'm alone in the universe. It's an unbelievably beautiful sensation. But then you realize also it is a harsh environment, and, you know, it's intolerant of error. So that's why we work so hard training to be able to succeed. But it's the most amazing, unbelievable freedom that you ever have, just being able to float around, look out the window, and experience the beauty of our planet.
All right, so I opened one more poll. I want the students tuning in today to use one word to describe what it was like hanging out with Dave today, and we'll check that near the end. But Mrs. Gallant, let me turn your mic on and we'll steal a question.
Hello. So we have a lot of questions about feeling nervous or being afraid. Is there any experience that you'd be comfortable sharing about a time when you felt very nervous on one of your missions?
Well, first of all, let me say it is totally normal to feel afraid. I mean, being afraid is a good thing, actually, if you're a human, because that's what stops us from getting injured. And I remember on my first space flight, You know, we go through, I was one of the flight engineers. I'm on the flight deck. We go through this incredible 4-hour pre-launch checklist. The last thing takes place in the space shuttle at T-minus 2 minutes. You close the visor of your helmet, you turn the oxygen on, you wait for 2 minutes. And I remember looking out the overhead window going, wow, it's a beautiful day for a launch. It's just incredible. Then at T-minus 15 seconds, I had this huge reality check. It was really scary. I'm sitting there thinking, in 15 seconds, I'm going to be sitting on top of essentially a controlled explosion. And I don't know how this is going to work out. I hope it's going to work out. I hope 8.5 minutes later, we're going to be in space and things. So you get used to the fact that, yes, it's okay to be afraid. And I think courage comes from working through something that you know that you're afraid of. And, you know, people talk about the astronauts and they say we're very courageous, we're heroes and things. And maybe there's an element of truth to that. But, you know, my hat goes off to the families of the astronauts, the spouses and the kids who are watching us going and doing this, understanding that there's risk involved, and they know what happened with Challenger and Columbia. So it's just one of those things where anything that's really worth doing often has risks associated with it. We don't take chances. We manage risk by training and understanding the risk. And yep, the first time you do it, it is kind of scary, but that's one of the things that we work through and we're able to achieve. The first spacewalk I did, I remember Rick Mastracchio and I saying, oh, you know, what's the view going to be like? You open the airlock and we're looking straight down at the Earth, you know, hundreds of miles below us and things. Turns out we opened the hatch, it was nighttime. You couldn't see anything. We had to turn on our helmet lights and things. But later on, when the sun came up, the view was pretty incredible. Translated means it was kind of scary. And then over the course of that spacewalk, we kind of calmed down. The training kicks in and we're able to do what we need to do.
All right, Mrs. Caminiti, your microphone is on.
So one of my students, actually, I'm going to hand it over, if that's okay, Joe, to one of my students, Emma. She raised her hand, so can I get her to do that question first?
All right, Emma, you're on.
How did it feel to feel gravity again?
Challenging. After you've been in space, whether it's a week, 2 weeks, 6 months, or a year, when you come back to the Earth, your body feels heavy. It's a strange sensation because you think that you should be able to just get up and walk around and carry things, but it's hard to be able to do that. And when we do research to understand the changes that take place in the bodies of astronauts, we put volunteers at bed rest. We put them into bed. So imagine if you went to bed and you stayed in bed for 6 months. What it'd be like when you stood up. As soon as you stand up, you're probably going to feel lightheaded, like you might faint. You're going to feel weak. You might even feel a little bit dizzy. And if you had to pick up something heavy, you're going to feel like it weighs a lot because your muscles are deconditioned. So we kind of joke and we say when we come back from space, you feel gravitationally challenged, which is pretty true. But the funny part is all these strange things happen to you. Your body feels really, really heavy. And yet when you lie down on the bed to go to sleep at night, the first night you're back on Earth, you feel like your body's planted on the surface of the bed. And then you begin to get this illusion like you're floating up towards the ceiling like you would if you were in space. So it's kind of interesting learning what it's like being back in a gravitational environment after a mission.
All right, and Mrs. Caminiti, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Speaking of sleep, was it weird sleeping standing up?
You get used to it. You know, you can sleep in any position you want. And the funny part about being in space is it's much easier to nap. If you want to have a nap in space, just close your eyes. And what's going to happen? Your arms are going to kind of float in front of you. Your legs are going to kind of float up and you're going to float around in the module or wherever you are. If you're on the space shuttle on the middeck or the flight deck and things. And it's a really relaxing sleep. And then, you know, after you have your nap, 15, 20 minutes later, you wake up and you go, oh, here I am. And then you grab whatever handrail is there and you go back to work. You know, it's a totally different environment. And by the way, you can always tell if a photograph of an astronaut sleeping is real or not, because if they're really asleep, their arms are floating up in front of them like that. And I remember on my first space flight, I was sleeping and I had this dream. It was kind of strange. I thought somebody was reaching out to grab my neck. And that was a little scary, to be honest with you. So I woke up, I was really startled. And then I saw these hands in front of my face and I realized they're my own hands and things. But that's kind of the fun of being in space. And by the way, until you go to space, you can't really have a dream about what it's like being in space. But when I was in space, I had dreams that were terrestrial 1G Earth dreams. I also had space dreams. And now that I'm back on Earth, I have space dreams, which are really cool. It's like going back to space without having to go through the training for a mission and things. But I also, of course, have Earth dreams as well.
All right. Well, I'm gonna back to the Slido room for the answers that that students who were joining us shared. Dave, awesome came up the most, but we had cool, spectacular, interesting, inspirational, phenomenal, eye-opening, intelligent. So I think that the groups really enjoyed hanging out with you today, Dave, and getting to know you a little bit better.
Well, thanks very much. I thought the questions were awesome. You guys are fantastic. And, you know, I think it's really cool that one of you, or more than one of you, maybe a whole bunch of you, might become the next generation of astronauts to explore the final frontier of space, might become the next generation of aquanauts and marine scientists to explore the final frontier of the undersea world, or might become a researcher that is involved in curing cancer in a research lab. And, you know, that's not to say that the arts aren't important. The arts are really, really important. And I think one of the things that's so important about space is being able to write about the experience, share photographs of the experience and paintings of the experience, because at the end of the day, despite the compelling nature of the research, it's all about being human and appreciate doing these amazing things together in a group of people that, to be honest with you, become like your brothers and sisters after you finish the mission. So I've been thrilled chatting with you today. And, you know, if you have time, you can order my books. There's 4 books for children that you can get online: To Burp or Not to Burp, Go for Liftoff, Train Like an Astronaut, Mighty Mission Machines, Destination Space, or if you want to read my memoir, they're all available from Amazon or Indigo, wherever you might be. Anyway, it's been a real pleasure being here today. And Joe, thanks so much for having me again. It was a lot of fun.
Well, Dave, it was great to have you. A huge shout out to everybody on YouTube today. So many great groups. Huge shout out to our on-camera groups. If you do want to dive a little bit deeper today at 3 p.m. Eastern, we are connecting with scientists, marine biologists, who were on an expedition off the coast of Brazil on a remote island, diving up to 500 feet looking for new species of reef fish. So very technical diving to get to depths of over 200-300 feet. So you might want to check that out. Dave, again, a huge pleasure. It was great to have you joining us today, and we look forward to another event.